Okay, hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief update on the top events currently going on in Israel for the week. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so by using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Afnaf, and good evening from Israel. Probably like most of you, I just have been trying to watch the historic speech by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think it's still going on as far as about a minute ago. So there could be parts which I haven't seen, so I can't really comment on. So it could be some of my comments about what was said and what was not said will no longer be true even after a few minutes. So it's a bit of a difficult situation. Perhaps we should have delayed it half an hour, but it was meant to be finished by now. But perhaps it's the standing ovations that delayed it, elongated it a little bit. But we'll try and get through with at least what I did here up until a minute to 10. First of all, let's go into the historics and the optics. It's the fourth time Netanyahu has addressed a joint session of Congress, the first leader, I believe, ever to do so. It's the first time since 2015. If we cast our mind back to that moment, it was an opportunity for Netanyahu to rail against the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, something that Israel was very strongly against at the time, and it flew in the face of the Obama administration. But in the end, as we know, the JCPOA was signed, and Netanyahu tried to take some credit for some of the aspects of it, but he was certainly pleased when then President Donald Trump took America out of the JCPOA. Today, it's more, let's say, positivist. It's more about what he's asking America to do. The first question that everybody in Israel is asking, or around the world, is who exactly was the audience for this speech? Well, obviously, the audience primarily was in that room, senators, congressmen, other decision makers, opinion shapers. We know vice president and presidential candidate. I think it's official. I'm not sure if it's yet official. Until the Democratic Convention, Kamala Harris was not there. It's clear that while no one would have expected at that point, at least, that President Biden would have stepped aside and Kamala Harris would have been the Democratic candidate, it's clear that they didn't want the optics of Vice President Kamala Harris either clapping along with the rest of the House at every sentence that Netanyahu gave, or at least the rousing sentences. And they also didn't want the opposite of her sitting while everyone else was clapping. So they took the easier option and basically arranged an event for her somewhere else, I believe at her former university, something that could easily be cancelled or moved or whatever it was. But it was clear that the optics of either a very supportive Kamala Harris or a very unsupportive Kamala Harris wouldn't have done well, even when she was number 2 on the ticket, and even more so when she's top of the ticket. So that, along with around, according to Israeli TV at least, around 90 other members of the House and Senate who boycotted the event, certainly didn't dispel the speech. We know Netanyahu is a great speaker. He's a great orator, especially in English. He's, American educated, speaks perfect English and knows how to give a speech. As I said, this is the 4th time he's spoken. But as much as he was speaking to the people in the room and to the wider American people, his main audience was back here in Israel. And we can tell that always by the fact that these speeches are given prime time Israel. They know the Israeli networks will be, as they were, showing it live. They were given the speech in advance so they could translate it, so they could put translate it and subtitles in time, and the fact that it took place when it took place. And as well, by the way, the meeting with President Biden tomorrow is also prime time Israel. These things are very well organized, very well ordered. Netanyahu's team knows how to get these things organized so the Israeli population is, at its, peak moment when it's sitting down watching the news after work, before bed. And it's clear that this was, to a certain extent, not completely, to a certain extent, stage managed with an Israeli audience in mind. We know that Netanyahu is flailing a little bit in the polls, even though he's stabilized recently. And it looks very good for him to be welcomed, to be greeted, to be applauded, to be lauded by the US. He will get those photo ops with President Biden, with former President Trump, with Kamala Harris as well. And this looks very good for him. As far as the speech, again, I can't talk for anything I didn't see, but as usual with the Netanyahu speech, lots of rhetoric, a little bit of props. The rhetoric, there was nothing particularly new, especially for Israeli ears, let's say, or even those in America who follow these things very closely. He gave Israel's case, not just in the war itself, not just about the wider battle with Iran, but also the context for Israel, for Israel's existence, for Israel's fighting for its existence, why we fight, and also gave justifications for why Israel reacted on October 7th, quoted a well-known military historian, I think is Spencer, I can't remember his first name, who said that no army in the history of man has done more than Israel to minimize casualties on the other side. All these sort of points about Iran heading the axis of evil, how when you're fighting Hamas, you're fighting Iran, when you're fighting Hezbollah, you're fighting Iran, Houthis, etc. All these points were delivered. The props, sometimes he brings a picture, sometimes he brings something else. This time, the major focus was on 3 or 4 soldiers that were in the audience. He said he didn't know about the 4th one until the last minute, who wasn't in uniform. But interestingly, again, especially in the US, where everything is down to identity politics, out of the 3 that he brought, one was an Ethiopian Israeli, one was a Muslim Arab Israeli soldier, and he spoke about each of their bravery and asked them to stand up. He also asked Noah Agmani to stand up and take applause, the recently released captive, which he was at great pains to say he ordered that brave operation. And he also spoke about Yechiel Leiter, who lost a son in the battle. He didn't mention that Yechiel Leiter is a very close confidant and has worked with Netanyahu in previous administrations, but he touched all the right emotional points. He tried to make the point to the people in the room and wider America and around the world what Israel's fighting, the evil that it's fighting. Some of the aspects which many were waiting to hear about, at least again, I should stress that I heard or didn't hear, there was very little new. There was very little original or ground laid. People waiting to hear more details about how we envisioned the day after. Now, I've explained previously many times the difficulties we're talking specifics about the day after, because you can't really talk about things that could put people in peril. No one wants to be seen as a stooge for Israel, whether it's the Arab nations, whether it's Gazans themselves, or even the Palestinian Authority. No one is going to agree and say that they're going to come in at this point. So it's not surprising he didn't go into too many details. He did talk about the demilitarization of Gaza. Not that that's entirely unexpected, but the fact that he mentioned it out loud, the demilitarization, de-radicalization of Gaza, is important, even though he didn't say how that's going to take place. But certainly didn't give too many details beyond that. Another thing he didn't mention details on, and again, I think it's a little bit unfair to expect him to do so, but that was the expectation in Israel, is the hostage deal. There's been a lot of talk, even, I would argue, a little bit of hope It was talked about earlier today, especially by the Hostage Families Forum, who had a big screening in Tel Aviv, had a march and then a screening, that they thought maybe against the odds, he would say that we've come to some deal or something close to a deal, or mention how things are going, or give some sort of positivity or optimism about the hostage deal. Again, from what I heard, there wasn't any. Again, I think it's a little bit unfair to expect him to talk about the details or to say that we're reaching a deal, because obviously that plays into Hamas's hand. As far as the hostage deal that we know, the negotiators are only going to Doha next week. There's been some criticism about that. There was talk that they would go on Thursday. Now, the reason given why it's been delayed is because when Netanyahu sits down with President Biden and have a heart to heart, or as they call it in Israel, four eyes, in sort of an intimate discussion, they want to know whether President Biden will back Netanyahu's demand, if you will, that Israel can return to fighting if necessary. That is a key demand of Netanyahu. It's absolutely necessary for him to reach what he calls total victory, even after or during a deal. And he wants to know if he will get that from President Biden. There was no mention specifically, from what I heard, whether Israel remained specifically in the Philadelphia corridor, in the Netzarim corridor. But obviously these are details to be worked out. And while he says one thing to the Israeli audience, he said in Rafah, we will not leave here. He didn't mention that specifically in the speech. There are some negotiations, especially with Egypt, exactly what Israel's presence or Israel's ask or obligations would be to ensure that that particular corridor will not be used again to rearm Hamas. But we'll have to wait and see exactly what that looks like, and whether Israel will push and even have its demand accepted to have some sort of presence along that. As far as the speech itself, talking to domestic politics, it was obviously much, much easier for Netanyahu to praise President Biden at this point. If President Biden was still in the race, with the numbers looking the way they are, with President Trump and his tenuous relationship, probably he wouldn't have given as much praise to Biden as he did. But now that Biden is out of the race, it's a lot more comfortable for Netanyahu to do so. He obviously also gave President Trump ample praise for what he did as president, the Abraham Accords, recognizing Jerusalem, the Golan, etc., and also his bravery in the assassination attempt. So obviously he felt he had to be even-handed, and he certainly gave enough praise to President Biden, but also ensured that he would give enough praise to President Trump, because he knows he'll be seeing him in 2 days in Florida. Just in the last couple of minutes, local politics, again, everything is connected. Tomorrow is the last day of the Knesset, the summer Knesset session. We've talked about that before, that Netanyahu might want and hope that he'll get a bit of a breather until the Knesset reconvenes in November. I can't remember exactly the date, but it will be after the Jewish holidays, which is after the summer holidays. So he gets quite a large legislative breather, but the fights go on. The issue of the enlistment of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. The first 1,000 enlistment papers were sent this week. We don't know exactly what happened to them. The communal leaders, the rabbinic leadership, has told their followers to just ignore them. So at this point, we have not seen the mass demonstrations that we've seen in the past against enlistment, which shows that they want to wait and see exactly how this plays out. If there will be scenes of taking people to prison, that could obviously change things. The economic sanctions are being, let's just say, absorbed for this at this moment in time, partly because of international Jewish donors, but they're sort of waiting to see. As I said, the ultra-Orthodox community, political leaders are not leaving the government at this point. Where there are fractures is once again inside the cabinet between the national religious Zionist parties led by Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the ultra-Orthodox parties led by Deri and Gaffney and others on the United Torah Judaism. We saw today, again, a back and forth between Itamar Ben-Gvir and Aryeh Deri. Itamar Ben-Gvir went up to the Temple Mount, as he likes to do every so often. He mentioned that he prayed, something which is supposedly outside the status quo, and he was immediately attacked by some of the ultra-Orthodox community that said it's forbidden and they shouldn't do that. And he basically snapped back. And at the heart of this all is really the debate of Ben-Gvir's place in the decision-making process. Ben-Gvir very much wanted to sit in the now defunct war cabinet. He still wants to sit in the war cabinet, even though the war cabinet really doesn't exist ever since Benny Gantz left the National Unity Government. But Itamar Ben-Gvir wants something. There was talk of creating some sort of alternative advisory committee that would replace the war cabinet. But apparently Aryeh Deri vetoed it, along with Defense Minister Gallant. The reports that Deri vetoed it led Ben-Gvir to quip, well, you didn't veto Oslo. It's something which the far right like to use against Aryeh Deri, the leader of the Shas party, knowing that the majority of his voters are more hawkish than he himself is, and the fact that the Shas party in the votes on the Oslo process in 1993 abstained, but knowing that their abstention would lead to the passage of the Oslo Accords through the Knesset, which was then led by Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And as I said, there seems to be deep distrust between the parties. It's going to carry on. People do see 2025 as a very possible election year in Israel. We'll know in November whether that's going to happen. And probably what's happening at this point is Itamar Ben-Gvir is trying to show his people that while I only got 6 votes, so I didn't have that much power, wasn't able to demand that power. He was able to demand it, but he wasn't given it. If you give him double the amount of seats, this is the message he'll show, that he can no longer be ignored. The fight between Itamar Ben-Gvir and Aryeh Deri is also over their population. There are a lot of hawkish Shas voters who want a more strong militaristic response, and they are starting to move towards Ben-Gvir and away from Shas. So a lot of it is purely down to domestic politics, but this is something that is going to be awaiting Prime Minister Netanyahu when he returns from the US. He will return probably, feeling good after a good speech in Congress with lots of standing ovations, meetings with President Biden. I'm sure nothing will be publicly disagreed upon, and a good meeting and a make-up. But let's not forget, this is the first meeting with President Trump since President Trump had very choice words to say about Netanyahu when Netanyahu greeted and welcomed President Biden's re-election, and that was something that annoyed Trump very much at the time, and he even gave a few interviews where he called him all sorts of things. So there's obviously going to be a make-up, a patch-up between Trump and Netanyahu, which is something Netanyahu craves, especially if, as according to polls, President Trump does return to the White House. So all of that to look forward to over the next couple of days, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. Now, you talked earlier in your discussion about the notable absence of Vice President Kamala Harris and its implications. Can you comment on the feelings in Israel regarding the prospects of a Kamala Harris presidency?
Well, it's interesting. I was in the Knesset yesterday, and there were some reporters who were dying to get something on record about Kamala Harris's non-appearance. And even the most hawkish members of Knesset would not go on record. No one wants to attack her. She is the vice president of an administration and potentially a future president. I mean, the polls, I've seen conflicting polls, and I'm not going to wade into domestic American politics, but, she at least stands a chance, and there is a possibility she will be the president. But it certainly doesn't look good from Israel. People are disappointed from left and right. Certainly the Zionist majority in Israel, will be very disappointed that she wasn't there. They probably don't understand the politics and the optics. It was simply, she should have been there. There's really no excuse, and there isn't. All the other excuses that were given by American officials, everybody knows that you can fly around the country in the US very simply, especially, in the final months of a campaign, you're doing sometimes 2 or 3 states in one day. So, it's possible to fly back to Washington and then, go back on the campaign trail. So that certainly did not go down very well in Israel from any of the members of Knesset I spoke to, opposition or coalition, left and right. But obviously, no one's going to go on record. No one's going to publicly attack her for that. But it's certainly not something that it just feeds into this narrative that, and this is something which has been debated a lot since President Biden dropped out, whether Kamala Harris, whether there was this good cop, bad cop play going on, where Biden was the good cop towards Israel and Kamala Harris would make the problematic comments as she had in many speeches. Again, they're not as fierce as some on the more far progressive left of the party, but ostensibly, according to this narrative, she was used to try and bring in the more radical left wing by being more critical of Israel, even from the near the top of the administration, and try and bring in some of those who are disappointed with President Biden's full-throated support at times of Israel, and proclaiming himself a Zionist and giving Israel what it needs, more or less, to fight its battles. So this is something which has been debated in Israel. Obviously, we look at it in a very myopic way, very much, how this works for Israel. Like every country in the world will look at President Biden's leaving the race, how that affects the race and how that affects their relations with their particular country. Israel, obviously, in the middle of a war, will look at this very strongly. And it's not necessarily seeing Kamala Harris as a strong friend of Israel, even though before she entered politics, she was considered more of a friend of Israel. And there's been lots of media about the fact that her stepchildren are fundraising for Palestinian causes, etc., even though they're Jewish. Her husband is Jewish. But she certainly, according to all polls I've seen, the majority of Israelis support Donald Trump. And many American Israelis will go to the polls later in the year to vote for Donald Trump. I'm sure some will also vote for Kamala Harris, but certainly the majority of Israelis at this point in time would prefer a Trump presidency.
All right, thank you. Now, I'm going to get to Trump here in just a moment, but there's been a number of other notable absences in Congress from the Prime Minister's address, but it's also been almost impossible for him to get through 3 or 4 sentences without a standing ovation break. Now, do you feel that there is still, do you think that that still signifies that there is still bipartisan support for Israel as it faces this 7-front war?
Yes, there is still bipartisan support, and we've seen that throughout the war when there were votes that have passed. They passed overwhelmingly. And we must not forget, when we shine a light on the extremists, they're a minority. They're a loud minority, and the media loves to be a microphone for them, but they are still a minority. Even if we go to the highest number that people talked about tonight, 90 members of Congress and the Senate, that's still a fraction. The vast majority were there. The vast majority applaud. Even someone like Chuck Schumer, who's an open disagreement with Netanyahu, called him to resign. He still showed up. He still put his name to the invitation, probably through gritted teeth. But it's, for him at least, who considers himself a friend of Israel, he was there more to celebrate and applaud the position, the standing of the prime minister, rather than the actual individual Benjamin Netanyahu himself. So yes, there is still bipartisan support. It certainly has moved over the years. More and more Democrats are taking a more critical position of Israel. We can debate whether it's purely ideological or partly because of purely political, as there is a growing Arab, Muslim, or far left contingent around the country, especially in battleground states, We can certainly have that argument. I'm not going to get into that at this point. But certainly we see that more and more in the Democratic side. And so it is eroding in a small way. It's still not significant. As I said, all the significant votes have gone through Congress, have gone through the Senate. But it's certainly eroding, and we'll have to see how the elections shape up later in the year and in the years ahead. But there is a concern, which I've heard voiced by many, that it's just going to get worse and worse. And perhaps President Biden is the last openly supportive, strongly supportive, even someone who calls himself a Zionist. That word has become a dirty word amongst many in America, even though it's a very positive word. It's not many people will openly state it, even if they consider themselves a supporter of Israel. So I've heard voices from the US who said that this may be the last openly, fully supportive Democratic president. But again, we'll have to wait and see what the future brings.
Now, we have a question from Eric Selkov, who asks, do you think it's important for Israeli officials to not take sides in the upcoming American election?
I think it's vital. Israel cannot get involved. First of all, we shouldn't get involved in foreign elections. Second of all, we wouldn't want it, and we don't like it when foreigners get involved in our elections. There was talk throughout the years of, I think it was Bill Clinton's advisors helping Ehud Barak with his victory back in the day, and that there was an NGO which was supported even by the Obama administration. There's always this sort of talk, and it's certainly not helpful on either side. And so no Israeli leader, no Israeli official should wade into the American debate. Now, Itamar Ben-Gvir is the only Israeli, again, who, some say you can't really shut the man up, but he is the only one who's openly said that we want a President Trump second term. And now that may be a voice which is heard behind closed doors by many, many more, but it's not the kind of thing that's done, between any two democracies. So it is vital that Israel and Israeli officials do not get involved with foreign elections, and certainly not our closest ally, because at the end of the day, we need as much as possible to keep that bipartisan relationship, because we can't be just thinking, okay, if Donald Trump is even a shoo-in to win, he's only going to be there 4 years, and then it could be a Democrat, and then it could be a Republican. So it's important, and the House and the Senate can move back and forth. So it's important to retain that bipartisanship. So Israeli officials, most of them, 99.9% of them, understand that, despite Ben-Gvir, and I hope that will remain true up until the elections themselves.
All right. Now, you touched on this briefly in your remarks, but can you comment on Netanyahu's planned meeting with President Trump and how it might differ from his meeting with President Biden?
Well, first of all, Donald Trump holds no official position. It's not going to be as official and formal as a White House sit down with the current president is going to be. I'm sure it'll be a lot less informal. The meeting itself, usually have advisors sitting around the table, elected officials or their people that they brought in. And Donald Trump is he's a plain speaker. One thing that we know about him. So I'm sure he will have some grievances. He'll probably put them out there. But I'm sure ahead of the meeting, a lot of people on both sides who retain the relationship, even while the Trump-Netanyahu relationship has soured, they've probably calmed things down. I'm sure both sides want to show, it's in both sides' interest to show a good relationship. Netanyahu certainly wants to show that he has an excellent relationship with Donald Trump. And I think it will be good for Donald Trump to show he has a good relationship with Netanyahu, especially after tonight. Netanyahu's stock in the US, at least, will have risen, especially amongst Republicans, especially in red states. And I think it will be a very good photo op for Donald Trump and Netanyahu to look like, the hatch has been buried, as they say, and it's water under the bridge, and we're moving on beyond that.
All right, thank you. Now, unfortunately, we have run out of time and we've reached the end of this week's podcast. I want to thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time to update us.
Thank you.
Of course. And to our audience who has tuned in today, we are flattered and grateful that you would choose to watch our podcast when you could have actually been watching the Prime Minister himself live. And so we thank you, especially for joining us today and for your participation. And before we go, please be on the lookout for our weekly podcast offerings email coming out over the weekend. As always, we hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you again for joining us.